I would like to talk about the importance of the memorial service, what we're having today, and also how Shinran spoke about grief. And I'd like to begin by reading a poem by Kobayashi Isa, who is a noted haiku poet and Nembutsu follower in Japan. A bitter persimmon's bitterness itself turns naturally into its sweetness. Now, Isa experienced the unimaginable sadness of the death of his mother when he was 3 years old. And then later in his life, his wife died, as well as 3 of his children. And in this poem, Isa is expressing that the bitterness of the persimmon represents the sad separations in his life. However, just as the bitterness of the persimmon itself turns naturally into sweetness, the sadness itself is gradually transformed into the kindness of his heart. I wanted to use this as my opening passage, as today is our monthly memorial service. And I'd like to talk about, as I mentioned, the importance of the memorial service in our tradition. Now, historically, in many Buddhist traditions, there are memorial services conducted on a scheduled basis. The seventh day memorial after death is considered important because there's a legend that in Buddhism that the baby Buddha took 7 steps as soon as he was born. And so they're very symbolic of these 7 steps at his birth. And Siddhartha had already transcended the 6 worlds of delusion we live in and stepped into the world of enlightenment. So from this legend, it has been thought in India that the number 7 symbolized a cycle of the beginning or closure of a new life form. So services are conducted every 7 days until the 49th day. Now, the 49th day memorial, which is deemed important because it comes at the end of all the cycles, at the end of the seven cycles, and reaching life's fulfillment and birth in the Pure Land. The number 49 is important in Buddhism because it refers to the enlightenment of Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha. And he attained Buddhahood after 49 days of sitting in meditation under the Bodhi tree. So in many traditions, these services are done for the benefit of the deceased, to help them. But in our Jodo Shinshu tradition, the memorial services are not done for the benefit of the deceased because their birth is assured due to the vow. So although memorial services are held in memory of loved ones who have passed away, the purpose of the memorial service is for us, the living, the ones who remain behind. And it's a time to reflect upon our lives and express appreciation and gratitude for the many benefits we've received from the person who passed away and how we are continually being influenced by them. So in our Twin Cities Buddhist Sangha community, fewer people are asking for the 7th and 49th day or annual memorial services. I remember as a child, a lot of the Issei and Nisei used to do that pretty regularly. But maybe it's because we really don't have a resident minister to do them regularly. I'm not really sure. But now that we are able to have a monthly memorial, like we are today, they're called Shotsuki services. We're able to recognize our loved ones on the month of their death collectively as a Sangha. And because of these memorial services, many people feel that the Buddhist tradition is maybe very dark and sad with this focus. But in fact, it can be said that we emphasize our death rather than our birth. However, the purpose of having these memorial services should not make us feel sad, but they should help us appreciate our condition and to remember ancestors who have made our present life so meaningful. So as we face the darkness of death, we become aware of the meaning of our birth. So in that sense, only when we're able to accept death can we truly celebrate our birth. So in this way, a sad occasion is transformed into a happy one. Now, in the Japanese language, these monthly services are actually called Shotsuki Hoyo, which means joyous month. And it's joyous because through this act of attending the Shotsuki service and remembering our family members and friends, we're given the opportunity to encounter the teaching of the Buddha. We can say that it is the person who passed away that has called us together and given us the opportunity to listen to the teachings of the Buddha. So it's their gift to us. So in this way, the experience of losing someone can really become a beginning of a new life for us. And the experience of losing a loved one is a renewed encounter with the Dharma. It's a chance to begin a new life with eyes open, a new life with a better understanding of ourselves, and the world that we live in. So remembering our loved ones makes us realize that our foundation was actually created before we were born, while allowing us to realize the new life that unfolds before us. So when we think in this way, Shotsuki is a joyous gathering and a celebration of the life that we are able to enjoy today. The death of a loved one is a very difficult time in our life, of course. And the Buddhist teachings remind us that none of us can avoid this experience. So we can talk about the Buddhist teachings of impermanence, try to objectively and intellectually understand how we each should feel about the reality of life, to speak of grief in the abstract, yet when we personally experience this grief, a loved one in our lives dies, it can feel very different, very emotional and overwhelming. The grief can be very painful. It never really fully goes away, but it does change over time, and it's based on the attachments that we have as humans. Our Jodo Shinshu tradition reminds us that we don't need to feel bad about our grief or try to get rid of it or try to resolve it, but to understand it and to gradually allow ourselves to become whole again, to proceed with meaning and purpose in our life. And this is a process that does not have a schedule, doesn't need to be a stepwise resolution. It's not linear in its progression, but it does require effort. As Rebecca read in our reading of the Eightfold Path, the Buddha gave us a framework, a guide to how we can reduce our suffering in life. I've heard of an analogy of grief being like glitter. You know, when you have glitter, you can clean it up, but it never really goes away. You'll find it hidden in the nooks and crannies and will show up when you might least expect it. So a commonly told story is the Kisa Gotami story. Many of you already know it, but I'll tell a shortened version again for those of you who might not be familiar with it. And it's a well-known Buddhist story about a young woman, Kisa Gotami, who lost her only child to death. Beside herself with grief, clutching her child's body, Kisa Gotami went to her neighbors, asking for medicine to cure her baby. Now, seeing that the child was dead, her neighbors thought maybe she had lost her mind. One neighbor suggested she go see the Buddha. So Kisa Gotami went and begged the Buddha to cure her son. So he promised to help her if she would bring him a handful of mustard seeds with one condition. These seeds had to be obtained from a household that had never known death. So Kisa rushed to her village to search for the mustard seed, and everyone was willing to give her the mustard seeds, but no matter which door she knocked on, it always had the same story. Each house had experienced the death of someone, family or friend. Kisa learned that there was no house into which death had not entered. And so she realized that she had been oblivious to the grief of others. And death falls upon all, irrespective of age, virtue, wisdom, or innocence. And this was the cure that the Buddha effected for Kisa, the realization that nothing is permanent and that to believe otherwise is the source of all sufferings and delusions. Unfortunately, when we experience loss, it's easy to believe that no one else has ever suffered so much and we are alone. But we need others' help. We need our loved ones. Our loved ones often feel helpless and confused by the intensity of our own grief. And in the isolation of her suffering, Kisa Gotami was unreachable to her neighbors, and they didn't know how to help her. Yet it was only through their benevolent help and the Buddha's compassionate wisdom that she was able to experience for herself the commonality of death and the impermanence of all things. So with the aid of others, Kisa was freed from her isolation and able to see her own suffering in true perspective. So her response was to gradually take refuge in the Buddha and his teaching. Now, the Buddha was known for making the teachings personally meaningful and accessible to each person. So he understood we often need to make these realizations for ourselves and not just to be told. So I think it's helpful maybe to think of her journey, Kisa Gotami's journey from house to house, as a pilgrimage. By a pilgrimage, I mean it's encountering, seeing, and experiencing something greater than oneself. And by visiting with so many members of her community, Kisa realized the value of shared community support. So being together with them, she could see how others had experienced the same hardship. What she likely received, I think, through her pilgrimage was comfort, sympathy, and empathy from her neighbors, and by each of them sharing their stories. Shinran said in the Kuden show, And the credential is there. It's a notes on oral transmission, which was compiled by his great grandson Kakunyo. And what he said in that is, to support grieving people, first we should receive their grief, which cannot be expressed into words. Then we should be together with them. And in this way, we're reminded that the Sangha is where the Buddha lives and where the Dharma comes alive. And I think Shinran is explaining that there is a fundamental way to address grief by engaging in the process of grief and not denying it. So many of us are familiar with the story of Kisa Gotami and can understand the Buddhist concepts intellectually. Yet understanding it emotionally, I think, is a different story. And when we each personally encounter the grief of a loved one, intellectual understanding, intellectual reasoning, doctrine, it's not really on the top of our minds. And of course, I understand that all people experience death in their lives. And of course, I know that everything is impermanent, but I'm still emotionally distraught over the death of a loved one. I'm not a Buddha who can see the truth clearly. I am a foolish being with blind passions and attachments and emotions that will always be with me. Now, Shinran also said in the credential, we should not criticize people who are lamenting in sadness. When you are sad, you do not have to hold back your tears. So I think what he's saying is that the more we act with a brave face, the more we doubt ourselves. We're fostering a mistaken notion of pursuing the path by self-power. Person who understands other power or the power of others naturally weeps on this occasion. No reason exists for a foolish being like us to act in any way other than what is natural. So our thoughts, our actions are rooted in our greed, arrogance, our greed, anger, and ignorance. Because we are spiritually challenged, we're foolish beings with our blind passions. That's not something to be ashamed of. Nothing to feel we have to overcome. They are natural human feelings. So we should leave the matter of birth to the Buddha and be nothing other than ourselves. And according to the Jodoshin tradition, we're exactly the ones for whom Omina made the original vow. So Shinran is saying we can only face our sadness by being sad. By going through difficult experiences, we can then awaken to the profound feeling of love. He's encouraging us to just be ourselves with our doubts and confusion. Now, in the Jodoshin tradition, liberation depends upon seeing ourselves as we truly are, beings of foolish passion, selfishness, and delusion, who, like Kisa, are oblivious to the sufferings of others. And as such, we are quite unable to liberate ourselves, since our attempts to do so are, without exception, calculating and self-serving. Now, in Shin Buddhism, we take refuge and entrust ourselves to the Buddha of immeasurable light, wisdom, and compassion, who vowed to liberate all foolish beings. And through this entrusting, Amida Buddha's light enables us to gradually awaken to our self-centered nature, to realize the infinite interconnectedness of all things, to engage the world around us with growing understanding, tenderness, and kindness, and to respond to the whole of life with deep gratitude. Now, we just chanted the Shoshinge today, and in it, Shinran reminds us we are embraced by great compassion that penetrates our dark clouds of sadness. And what we just chanted, it says, the light of compassion that grasps us, illumines and protects us always. The darkness of our ignorance is already broken through. Still, the clouds and mists of greed and desire, anger and hatred cover as always the sky of true and real Shinjin. But though the light of the sun is veiled by clouds and mists, beneath the clouds and mists there's brightness, not dark. The deceased not only live in our memories of the past, but continue to live in our memories of the present and future. Whether you're suffering or happy, the departed are, as Buddhas, always comforting you, reminding you who you are and guiding you where you are going. Your relationship begins anew. So, of course, a short Dharma talk about grief doesn't really address the complexity of this subject. But to me, I think understanding that my reactions and emotions are okay, that they are really seeds of wisdom, that I'm embraced by the vow, it can help me begin to understand the grieving process. So I'd like to close by reading this Isa poem once again, so please join me in Gasho. A bitter persimmons, bitterness itself, turns naturally into its sweetness. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namanda Butsu. Namanda Butsu. Namanda Butsu.